Today's subject matter reminds me of Aesop's fable, The Goose That Laid the Golden Egg. Some of you might remember that story. It's about a cottager and his wife. They had a hen that laid a golden egg every day. Well, they supposed that the hen must contain some great lump of gold in its inside. So in order to get that gold, they killed her. Now, having done so, they found to their surprise that the hen differed in no respect from their other hens. Now, this foolish pair, thus hoping to become rich all at once, deprived themselves of the gain in which they were assured day by day. Now, the moral of this story, or fable, is we're going to talk about here today. Many of you have built up your nest eggs, or your clients have built up their nest eggs to where they now are going to be retiring. The main thing what we got to do, and we're talking, and I introduced Dan here in a minute, is don't become short-sighted on the destruction of a very valuable resource. And that valuable resource is this nest egg that's full of golden eggs that have been built up that will derive you income.
Hello and welcome to Valuability Episode 6, White Swan, Black Swan, Why Risk is More Important Than Return in Retirement. The Valuability Podcast is for financial advisors, business owners, and anyone interested in financial planning, business, leadership, and personal development. We believe that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. My name is Danforth Fleek. I was a financial advisor and product wholesaler for over 20 years, and I'm joined each week by Philip Simonson, my longtime friend and mentor. Philip, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing very well, Dan. Very well.
Excellent. Still nice and chilly up there in the great north.
I'm great Northland up here, where the Iron Range, northern Minnesota, Stranger Rangers, where the men are strong, but the women are stronger. Yes, and I'm looking out at the frozen tundra. We still probably have 15, 20 inches of ice on the lake.
Oh, wow. I'm just down in Minneapolis. Our lakes are completely open down here, and that's
amazing.
Not a big surprise, though, where you live up there in the North Pole, as I call it. Tell the folks a little bit about your background, Philip.
Sure, Dan. Nearly 40 years in the industry. Started off as a planner. Really, I started off as a product salesperson. Then got my CFP, went into the financial planning. Then leadership, and really, and that leadership piece is now it's just been focusing on developing meaningful relationships with advisors and helping them become more proficient at their skills and around processes, and been doing that now, as I said, for nearly 40 some years.
Excellent. You can find the Valuability Podcast wherever you find your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn. We also have a YouTube channel. Search for Value-Ability on YouTube, and you can listen to our episodes there. You can also find us at value-ability.com. Click on the Episodes tab, and all of our episodes are posted there. Wherever you find us, like, review, subscribe, and share. Always have to include the podcaster mantra. And sign up for our mailing list as well if you would like special content. Value-ability.com. Click on the Contact Us tab, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Also important, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at value_ability. The Instagram is specifically important because that's where we post visuals, and we have some very important visuals today. And then also you can find us on Facebook. Search at Valuability, all one word, on Facebook if you want to find any of our content. We post almost all of our content on Facebook there. So, jumping into our main topic, White Swan, Black Swan, why risk is more important than return in retirement. Now, this piece actually came out of a conversation that I had was kind of a conversation. It was really more of a confrontation. So I used to do a ton of continuing education classes for advisors. It was a great way to get a group of advisors together. I actually really enjoyed the education part of my wholesaling career quite a bit. And so, I'd do a 4 or an 8 hour CE class, and often we would just kind of go through the material and then start discussing various topics related to whatever topic we were covering that day. And as my product was income-based, we did a lot of income-based topics, and one of them was around the idea of timing risk. So we were having this discussion, and I made the offhand comment that I thought was pretty non-controversial, that an 8% return portfolio with a high standard deviation while taking income was not as interesting isn't the word, isn't as coveted as a 5% return portfolio with a low standard deviation. And one of the advisors in attendance just could not let that comment go. Like, just came after me and was like, "That's incorrect. You're spreading false information. That can't be true." Like, literally, like, we got into a knockdown drag out, which, if you've been in this industry, you understand that as a wholesaler, you really don't want to do that with your clients, right? Especially in public, right? Getting into a straight up knockdown drag out. But like, he literally was like trying to discredit me in front of the other advisors, and it started to feel a little bit personal. I didn't know him super well, and so like I ended up going home and putting together this piece, which I will admit I did not run through compliance, and I used it only the one time when I scheduled an appointment to go see that advisor to show him what I had put together. Now, that original piece had, of course, a higher return, but the point of these pieces is that return really becomes almost meaningless as a measure of success in retirement. And we'll start out with a little example. Now, for those of you that are visual, you're going to want to go to our Instagram account at value_ability. We have it all in one piece. It will show up as 3 separate pictures on Instagram, or go to our website, value-ability.com, click on the episodes tab, and under episode 6, you will see the content button. Press on that, and there will be a link to the PDF of all 3 of these pieces together. But let me start out with a little example of why return isn't as important while taking income. And we'll use very, very basic numbers. These are not realistic, but just so the numbers are easy and you can understand them while you're driving along or running or doing whatever you're doing. I'm going to use very basic numbers. So let's say you have a mutual fund holding, and it is at $10 per share at the beginning of the year. And 6 months through the year, it is down to $5 a share. Again, not super realistic, not many funds that lose that much value, but just to make the math easy, right?
Right.
At that point, your client takes income, okay? So they're selling shares at 50% off, right? So it's also conversely taking twice as many shares to get the amount of income that they need, right? Now, let's say by the end of the year, that mutual fund has recovered and it's now at $12 a share. What return does that mutual fund report for the year? Well, the short answer is it reports a 20% gain. What is your client's gain in that account? It's not 20%. Let me give you the spoiler there, right? Now, this is the reason why standard portfolio return rates are not a good measurement of success in retirement. Just as you're telling your clients while they're saving, don't focus on the dollar amount, focus on the number of shares. We then get to retirement and then totally forget that, right? We never mention dollar cost averaging again once they get to retirement. And that's actually not true. You just start dollar cost averaging in reverse, right? Especially if you're taking monthly withdrawals, right? This is where both of the income methods that we've discussed recently, the 4 cornerstones and the need fund love method, come into play, is that they give you a regimented way of drawing income off of a portfolio and trying to do it in ways that doesn't encounter this. But if your client's taking monthly income, you're making this issue even more haphazard, right? Because now you're dealing with 12 different share values throughout the year, as opposed to just one. So with that, I want to jump into the piece and start talking a little bit about that. So again, if you're a visual person, put us on pause, go find the piece either at our Instagram at value_ability or at our website, value-ability.com. On the episodes tab, look under episode 6 and click on the link and it'll take you to the PDF. So the first page is the White Swan page. And now, using the term white swan, black swan, the way that they're used in financial circles is to denote either a positive or a negative occurrence that falls outside the realm of normal statistics, right? So in our recent memory, 2008 was a black swan, right? I would say the next decade was a white swan, right? We had an unprecedented run of market gains over the next 10 years. And now we're probably experiencing another black swan, right? This is likely going to be, whether it turns out statistically from a market standpoint to be a true black swan, we have yet to see, but it certainly is from a socioeconomic standpoint, right? Something well outside of our experience. But so white swan, this looks at a market where they take off right out of retirement. So first year. Now, each of these examples is just a $100,000 portfolio. We're taking a 5% withdrawal and increasing that withdrawal by 3% each year for inflation. So we just picking a standard withdrawal rate to compare the two scenarios, right? So at the end of this 20-year period, you end up with a little bit more than 100,000. I think it's around between 115 and 120 in total account value. The percentage return, 5.7%. Okay. Now this is the absolute example of my little catchphrase: if you're not ahead, you're behind. They get ahead and they stay ahead. And the reason that they stay ahead is that they got ahead. Right? It's a little bit of a Yogi Berra-ism, but the focusing on just the dollar amount doesn't really help you in retirement. Is the portfolio growing, right? Because our mind approximates things. So let's take a look at the Black Swan now. Now, the Black Swan, we see a horrific market event right out of the gate, and into that market, you are withdrawing income. So by year 3, your account value has dipped to about half, right? Now, in this example, it rebounds the following years, and that's very, very typical. If you run Monte Carlo simulations and look at just the failures, typically they involve some sort of very negative market very early on, and that market recovers. That's the natural cycle of the market, right? So now we get out to year 8, and they get back up to about a $90,000 account value. And this is, again, where the mind approximating values starts to trick you, right? So you're 8 years in. So if you started at 65, you're 73. You started with 100,000. You're now at 90. You've been taking income. Most people look at that, advisors included, and think, well, all things considered the first 3 years were so horrible, that actually ain't so bad, right? Now, the analogy, I've used this before, and I consistently use it. It's like the movie Titanic. I use that because so many people have seen that movie, and then they know the story of the Titanic. They hit the iceberg, but the damage is below the waterline, right? So most of the people on the ship are kind of walking around going, oh, what was that? Looks like we grazed an iceberg. Whereas the engineer pulls out the plans and says, we're taking on water in 5 or 6 compartments. We're going to sink. And everyone looks at him like he's crazy, right? At this point, I see many people that get into this point at 8 years in, their portfolio is recovered, and I run into them, and they're like, "Hey, I think I'm doing pretty good," and I say to them, "You're doomed," and they have a hard time processing that. Like, you have sold so many shares down that dip, and now this is over multiple years, right? Mm-hmm. That it is going to fail the next time there is a major negative down market. Now, I compressed this a little bit. It's usually not quite as often as this. This happens now in year 15. We see our next negative event. But then you go from having $60,000 to having zero in 7 years. And that's where I say, to continue the analogy, that's where the ship's sticking up out of the water and it breaks in half and goes straight to the bottom. And time again, when you look at failure scenarios, this is how it plays out. You kind of struggle along after an initial down market, and then a later down market sends you to the bottom very quickly and very rapidly. And so it's very, very hard to get people to understand that even though the things that kept you afloat by remaining calm and remaining committed and all of that aren't helping you the same way that they did, because you aren't a buy and hold investor anymore. Right? You are selling through all of those downturns. So,
and Dan, is it also fair to say the other thing here is you've given up your number one asset, your ability to work, and the income that generates. You don't have that to replenish the pot.
Right. Being able to turn off the income would solve a lot of that. And that's why when in our previous episodes, we've been talking about expense management is, hey, if you can reduce expenses and compress that want expense during those times and reduce the amount that you're taking out during those initial down markets, during that Black Swan, then you have a much better chance of recovering. Right? Because you're absolutely correct. You don't have that backup of another income source to switch to. And you're also encountering true inflation for the first time, right? While things are going, and many people do push back on that. They're like, well, can't a client just not increase their withdrawal by 3% per year? And I'm like, well, sure, but that's not going to... So they just buy less stuff. Now, naturally, over time, inflation causes people to have to budget, right? Like, if they're taking a set amount, if they're on a fixed pension or even Social Security, even though it's tagged to CPI, it doesn't keep up with true inflation. So over time, people learn that, hey, I'm going to have to spend less as I go into retirement. And so eventually you start to learn that that's just going to happen. Right. But yes, you don't have that ability to just flip off income anymore and switch back. Some people do if it's, very early on in retirement. Sometimes you do see that, or if someone retires early, say they retire at 55 or 60, sometime, and then they go through that negative event. Sometimes you will see them go back and do, maybe they'll take a part-time job in their field or do some consulting or get a part-time job in a totally different field. But overall, that option is typically not there for most retired folks.
Dan, you bring up, can I just, couple other things. The worst case scenario, and correct me if I'm wrong, that could happen to a client or anyone who is getting ready to retire is that in that first 2 years, they hit a recession. And we joked about this before, what's the difference between a recession and a depression? It's a recession when your neighbor's out of work. It's a depression when you're out of work, right?
Right.
So what are some specific action steps that you tell advisors out there listening, or the individuals who are out there listening, that they could take to overcome these risks?
Yeah, great point. Number one is to have built an income plan that takes this eventuality into consideration, right? Whether that's having a large cash reserve to get through, or it's a dividend withdrawal strategy. Now, even that you and I discussed off air. Companies can cut dividends.
That's the biggest risk right now. Some of these big blue chips, absolutely. Never thought I'd ever say that, but
right. Even some that are considered, all the consumer cyclicals that are considered absolutely impenetrable may.
Nothing's protected. Nothing's sacred at this point.
Correct. And that's the thing with these Black Swan events, right? These are the events that are outside the realm of normal events, and this is why they cause so much concern. And it's funny, actually, putting it into the idea. We've been talking about the response to the current crisis, and I was reading an article about a previous administration that dealt with not obviously a similar kind of situation in scope, but they suggested doing the things that we're doing for an outbreak that ended up not being nearly what we're facing today. And the guy who started suggesting it was ridiculed and pretty much run out of the government for being so chicken little about, hey, we've got to shut down the economy. We've got to. So my point there is you're either too cautious or you weren't cautious enough in these kind of situations, right? And so that's why so many advisors and clients look at folks who are this focused on risk and kind of go, oh, come on, lighten up. But the reality is that I had this conversation with my best friend the other day, who's not in the financial services industry, and he just offhand made the comment, did you ever think you'd live through something like this? And I said, after 2008, yes, actually I did. Like, I've started to realize that there are just these events that happen every 100 years.
Well, plague is one. We've always had a plague, and generalization always, but you go back in history, there's been some form of plague every 100 years, whether it's a natural cleansing. I'm not going to go there, but I think what I've also heard you say, and I think it's worth repeating, and we have a phrase for it. One of the key things you have to do here, if you are an advisor or just an individual planning your own financial future, you got to prepare for that certainty of uncertainty.
Right. That's
and you
exactly
can be certain, right? We're all going to die sometime, but we just don't know when. We're all going to retire sometime, we just don't know when. Business cycles are typically 3 to 5 years. But like you said, after that 2008, we went an unprecedented bull market of, longest in the history.
Right.
But all good things must come to an end, so you might as well get ready for it.
Right. And the reality is that it's unprecedented on both sides, right? There are white swans and there are black swans.
Yes, great point.
Right. The problem is that there are black swans. And the white swans don't make up for them. That's the problem when it happens at the wrong time for an income investor. They do not have the ability, like you mentioned, to shut off income and just stop spending. They
Right.
can't go back to being that buy and hold investor and just weathering the storm. And it's so ingrained in you after 40 years. And that's a discussion I have with clients is, look, we're going to start talking about some things that you have absolutely no reason to know, because there's no reason why you have had to experience them. And our topics in the next couple episodes are
Yes.
going to be the same in inflation and longevity. You don't have any experience with these things, and it's okay. Don't freak out and think, oh, I'm a bad investor, I haven't learned. No, you've been focused on the things you were supposed to focus on, and now we're transitioning into a new situation. And in fact, that's really the underlying point of this episode and the next two, is that when you are dollar cost averaging into the market, you have a set of things that are good, right? Volatility is actually great.
Right.
I'm reading answers from people that are like, this is awesome. I'm 40 and I'm buying the market on discount. I'm excited that this is happening, right? Volatility is good. And then you switch the spigot and now you're taking money out. It stands to reason that everything reverses, right? And it does.
Yes.
What was once good, return is the only thing that matters while you're saving, because you're not taking any money out and you're putting money in. In that same example, right, the $10 where the value goes to 5 and then you go back up to 12, your return's actually better when you're putting money into the market in that scenario, right? You get better than a 20% return. That's why we don't sweat it on the way in. But then it's really hard to then make that switch and understand that it is super important on the way out. The bottom line comes down to the value of your account really also becomes meaningless. What matters most is how much income you can safely withdraw without, as you mentioned, killing the golden goose, right? And it goes back to those other conversations we've talked about, the CEO employee conversation you have to have in your head. Like, don't take out that 50 grand to fix your deck or buy a Harley or whatever it is that you want to do. You can't slay the thing that is your means for generating income going into the future. And so that's Black Swan return is amazingly exactly the same as the White Swan return, 5.7%. Obviously, after 20 years, you are at 0 as opposed to having just over 100,000. And so that's really the point of this whole discussion is, again, look, return does matter in a general sense. Like, with the same amount of standard deviation, yes, I'd rather have an 8% than a 5% rate of return. But the point here is getting return by taking on more risk typically is not the strategy in retirement. Keeping risk low, focusing on keeping volatility down is the paramount importance. And so page 3 gives you the numbers behind both of these graphs. As you can see, the mean is 5.7. Now, the geometric mean is different, and of course the geometric mean takes into account the timing of all of the returns. And so you can see that because it's disproportionate in return early on, that changes the geometric mean for the Black Swan event. And the standard deviation on the White Swan is at 12%, just over 12%, whereas the standard deviation on the Black Swan is 17.5%. So you're taking on considerably more risk in that portfolio, which again is the reason why that return isn't as successful over time, along with timing, but having that higher standard deviation also does that. That really wraps up the main portion. Philip, did you have any other questions or comments you wanted to cover?
I want to build on what you said to to those who are advisors out there listening to us, one of your key roles is what Dan described there. You got to have this conversation with your clients. The hardest thing that we have to do as parents, as advisors or leaders, is to teach people how to think. And we need to, and one of the first jobs of a leader is to find current reality in a non-obscure way. And most people they'll do more to seek pleasure than they will to avoid pain. So, what you described here is potential pain if those first 2 years of retirement, you hit a recession. And I would just encourage people, if you do not have intentional conversations around this subject matter, and you need to feel more comfortable in approaching clients with this, well, the mother of all learning is repetition. Hit the pause button, hit the replay button, and then push the replay button, go back to this, or go back to the other couple sessions that we've talked about, the 4 cornerstones and the, as you said, need, want, and love episode. So that'll give you some good context. And I think these conversations need to be happening now, in the next 3 months, 4 months. What did you learn from this this last crisis, and to make sure, if and when it does occur again, we're prepared for it if it happens within our lifetime here.
Yeah, it's always the cycle, right? You start seeing articles in a big market downturn about, should we be talking about protection products? Should you be talking to your clients about guaranteed products? And this is one of those topics where, yes, it is a little bit advisor driven, but it's also quite a bit consumer driven as well, in that people tend to buy investment products at the wrong time. And all I can say to that is that doesn't change the need for your discipline to talk about them at the times where it makes most sense, which is at the top of a market. Now, there again, this is like we've had the life insurance discussion again. They're probably going to say no. Like, they just are. It's just human nature to say, I don't know, I don't think I need protection right now because everything's going well. And then once everything falls apart, it's very also human nature to say, where's that life jacket?
Yeah.
Right? As soon as the boat starts to sink, you think, where's that life jacket? And so, but again, if you're having those conversations, A, you know that you're doing it the right way, and B, it does make the conversation easier when they come back to you later because you've already planted that seed there.
Right.
So when they do come back to you later and say, hey, you know what, I know you mentioned, X, Y, or Z product or strategy, and I turned it down. I think now's the time to do that. And oftentimes then as an advisor, you have to coach them, hey, you know what? Now really isn't the time, but let's wait until your portfolio has recovered a little bit. Then we can implement that. So you just need to build that into your overall strategy. So with that, let's move on to the article section. This week, we have an article called 13 Predictions for a Post-Coronavirus World. We put the link out on our Twitter feed at value_ability, and it is also on our webpage, value-ability.com. Click on the content tab, and it will be under episode 6. A link to that article. Philip, you had a couple you wanted to start out with. We're not going to read all 13, so take the time to find the article and go through them. It's a slideshow, but we just wanted to pull a couple out each and talk about a few of them.
Sure. The first one, I do think what we're going to see, and it was going this way anyway, is you don't need the brick and mortar as much anymore. You can do more and more using the technology like Zoom, Skype, GoToMeeting. These face-to-face meetings will become, I think, more the norm. And what I've found too, maybe not in the initial you're establishing the initial relationship, but what I've learned over time, once the relationship's built and to the point where if you have the person's trust, the details aren't going to matter. If you don't have their trust, all the details in the world are not going to help you out. So if you've done proper planning with these clients initially, to address some of the things we've talked about now, what are their goals? Let's talk about the 4 cornerstones, and let's and you've built out the plan for them. Now they get the big picture. It's their plan. The trust has been built. You don't need to be face to face anymore. So I think that's going to be a big one, and I think our advisors, and we'll be doing more on this in future episodes, is building out the processes to get them ready for this if they're not already at that point, particularly the client review process, etc. So that's my first one. I think the next one, and I pray for this one, that our executive branch currently and the legislative branch can come together and pass an infrastructure bill. There's no better time than right now to borrow money at these interest rates. And that infrastructure bill, that rebuilding our streets, putting in new sewer systems, new airports, laying down, making sure the rural areas have the technology, the ability to do the technology to use the internet quicker. That's creating real jobs. The stimulus package is just a band-aid right now to hold people and keep people in their homes, hopefully keep things going. But long term, my generation, that's the best thing we could do for the next generation is so we can compete as a country throughout this century. So that was another one, and I hope that that does occur. And then human nature, it's a herd mentality, so consumers will become more cautious. I believe that is true. You look at the last, when we hit the Depression, then went into the dirty 30s, it took a long time for people to go back into the stock market. Right. Actually, they didn't start going truly the retail investor till after World War II. So it was over 15 years.
You saw effects of that even into their 70s and 80s. Right?
Absolutely.
Saving pieces of paper towel and things like that, which honestly, with the shortages that exist now, I've started doing some of that.
Well, thank you. And that's the great, that will be a value add benefit of this, is that we won't be maybe as much of that throwaway society. One, two, right. You and I talked about this before in another podcast, the ability to live with delayed gratification. That generation, if you can't pay for it with cash, you don't deserve it, was the mantra I got from my father. Well, we became such a credit society where over 50% of the people, in this country, I'm sure I think it's even greater than that, they don't have, a major crisis, like an event occurs that they don't have $500. They've got to go to their credit card or something, and those are maxed out. So I hope people can start building up that cornerstone to their cash reserves.
Right.
And with that, Dan, I'm complete. Those are the big 3 that I wanted to talk to.
Yeah, I a couple that leapt out at me. The bigger inventories to avoid temporary shortages. I think that will definitely likely be true right out of the gate, but I'll be interested to see if that's not one of those, it happens for a while, but then as companies start to, we get 4 or 5, 10 years beyond this, where they start to say, oh, do we really need that cost anymore? And it'd be interesting to see how quickly that gets trimmed back to the world of on demand supply. Growing defaults in high yield bonds. This one leapt out to me, but for a slightly different reason. When I came into the industry in the late 90s, we had just gone through the whole Michael Milken junk bond fiasco.
Yes.
And so I remember being taught about asset allocation and just being told, don't put any money in high yield bonds, period. They're terrible. And anytime you hear that about any kind of asset class, you need to take it with a grain of salt, because right before all of that, people were using high yield bonds as, juiced money markets. And that's what led to a lot of that, right. And then we've gone through that cycle a number of times since then. No, high yield bonds play a role in a portfolio. If there are going to be defaults, yes, you understand that. And yes, it's cyclical, but that's the reason why you own them. It's for diversification. Owning too much is the problem, right? Owning it in the right amounts is the correct. So that was an interesting one to jump out at me, because that specific asset class was one that when I first got into the business was a pariah, and it's always stuck with me. And then lastly is scapegoats will be blamed for the virus and the recession and the bear market. Two thoughts there. One, don't get dragged into that. Whether you're doing it for your own portfolio or for a client, there's nothing good that comes out of it. That, to go back to our 3 buckets, that's so bucket 3.
Right.
It doesn't. Yes, it does matter, but it's for people that are making fundamental changes to our society, not for us dealing with individual clients or our own individual portfolios. And so it's a waste of thought process. But then also, focus on that bucket 1, things you can control. What were the things that you did wrong that need to be corrected? What were the things that you did right that you need to remember going forward to accentuate? Those are really the things to focus on. Don't get caught up in that whole scapegoat conversation.
Yeah, Dan, in that bucket 1, I like to think about what goes inside that bucket 1. That's your emotions, your thoughts, and your behaviors. And you make a great point. Put the pause button on and self-reflect and think about what you need to be thinking about, so that you can control your emotions and your behaviors in a manner in which are going to be in alignment to what is important to you, be it your values, be it your goals, and make your decisions based upon that. Because you can't respond what's going to happen to you, but we all, and each and every one of us, gets to respond how we're going to react to what happens to us. That's the crucial point. And then bucket 2, for those who haven't listened, those are things you influence. And as Dan said, bucket 3, those are things you have neither control nor influence over. So back to you, Dan. That's my point.
Perfect. So with that, we'll move on to the question section. Start out, first question: how can you proactively plan to spend your spare time in retirement? Interestingly, even though I'm a little bit younger than Philip, because I took my midlife pause 3 years ago.
Number one
son. I'm being nice. I'm slightly younger than Philip. I actually took a midlife break after my mother passed away a few years ago. I ended up having some money that I had saved for her care, and I decided that I wanted to travel, and so I spent some time traveling, and so I've kind of went through a quote-unquote retirement phase, and I actually had a reason to have a more regimented life while I had stopped working. The dog I purchased just previous to going on that adventure was a Vizsla, a very, very, very high attention, high energy beast, and he requires daily exercise. So my life was actually quite structured, even though I was traveling and visiting people. My main focus every day was getting up and getting him out and getting him exercise, and that's really my kind of point to make in response to this question is having kind of a model week is something that could be very, very helpful in retirement, right? Like, even though it might be something that's not, quote unquote, a job task, but, something to hey, I'm got to get up and I'm going to do this task at this time, whether it's either each day or each week, or, just having a structure in general is something that would help you get out and get tasks done. Now, that's especially helpful if you have another being, whether it be a pet or another human, that is also depending on you for that. So as an example, whether you have a hobby with a friend where you go and you do that hobby together, maybe it's going for a hike or, whatever it is, but somebody you're doing that something with, I think also is something that helps you focus when you don't have the structure of a job, right? When you have that job taking up 40 hours a week, the other side of it too is you get lulled into this false sense of security that you have a ton of time, which you do, but it's also really easy to fritter away an entire day if you don't have like some structure to the day of what you're going to do. And so having those landmarks is the big one for me in terms of getting me motivated to do stuff. Philip?
Great point, and points that you make there. The model week, I think that's very important. And I think before you determine what your model week is, back up and figure out what are you passionate about, as you made that point as well. And to help me what helped me on this is that there's an exercise, a values exercise, and to help you want to determine what your values are internal to you, and those are the things that are important to you. So find out what your top 5 values are, and then align those values to your goals. And then those goals, then you can start making good decisions. And for instance, for me, creating meaningful work and meaningful relationships, I'm 62. I'm in semi-retirement. Dan, you called me up, and here we are. Right. Creating meaningful work, meaningful relationships. I'll take some time on Fridays or Thursdays, one of the 2 days each week, where you and I will do a podcast. Right. And it's kind of a way of paying forward. So that matches up to my value, create meaningful work and meaningful relationships. Find something that you're passionate about. I mean, our school system, are those teachers, you can volunteer there. I would just suggest Ken Dykewald, check him out. He's dealing with all this retirement and how we're living longer in retirement and things that, you've got to keep learning and you got to have a purpose. Those studies show who hit nirvana, they retire at 55 and they die sooner than the people who continue to work. I like what you've also said, Dan, is in your example, hey, you don't have to have every nanosecond covered in between 25 and 65. If you want to take a year off, take it off, and figure it out while you still can. Note this too, if you're not learning or if you're not growing, you're dying. So you make sure every day that I try to do is 30 minutes of exercise where I get, I maximize my heartbeat at the level where it needs to be. So aerobics, I'm staying in good health, because that's going to be in your retirement years. I look at, there's 3 stages of your retirement years. There's the first stage is your go-go years. And when I had clients, what I noticed at 78, they naturally don't want to travel overseas anymore. They want to stay closer to home because of health issues, etc. Then there's your slow go years, and then there's definitely your no-go years.
Let's hope we all make it to that.
Right? So that's just human nature. With that, I think we're pretty much wrapped up here, Dan. I know we're going to just one question here today.
Yep. Second question, how do you keep your cool when a customer is yelling at you or being rude? You want to start with that one?
I will. It's if we're going to take this one, you got it, and you just tossed me the ball, so here we go. First, if the best you can do at this point is press your pause for cause button. If this is over the phone, just you can have it on speaker, push the mute, take 3 deep breaths. And those 3 deep breaths, what's naturally good that's going to do, it's once you hit that high negative emotional state, and if that's how you're going to naturally respond to someone else being rude to you, not a good choice. But what happens, that amygdala hijack comes in. It's either fight or flight, and a drug called cortisol is released, and that's a brain inhibitor, and it's blocking you from accessing the prefrontal cortex of your brain where reasoning, logic, and planning reside. So hit the cause for pause button, take 3 deep breaths, brings oxygen back up to the brain, and because the cortisol was blocking the oxygen from going there because it needed it for the muscles to fight or flight. So just sit back and listen. And then, one thing is throw the ball back in their court and say, look, if you were the CEO of this company, what would you do to right this wrong? Other times, when I've inherited other people's problems in that relationship, the goose is, it's dying. Look, don't hold, I can't be held hostage. So what I would say is these words. I said, look, I can't go back and rewrite the beginning here. But what I can do with your help and together, we can start writing the ending. And that's what I want to focus in on here. What does the ending need to look like? So if we're again sitting down 3 years from today and you've said we've had a successful relationship, what must happen in order for that to occur? Now I've touched their heart and I've listened to them, and then go from there.
Yeah, I have a really interesting relationship with this kind of situation. When I was an internal wholesaler, my first promotion was to being a team lead, and one of my roles was taking the elevated calls. And so typically, what are the elevated calls? Where they're the calls that the other internal wholesalers don't want to deal with because the person's angry. Right? So it's the "can I talk to your manager" calls. And I actually had a great trainer at that position who taught me that number one thing to remember in those situations is the first thing is they want to be heard.
Yep.
So first and foremost, just let them go, right? So let them go on their tirade. And as they are explaining their frustration, they will naturally peak and then start to come back down. And if you try to interject at any point in that process, it's going to completely just send them higher, right?
Yes.
And so I actually got to be really good at this. I really enjoyed kind of like reeling people back in from these high emotional states. Once you let them crest and they've kind of spent their energy and they start to come down, I think absolutely, use those. While that is going on, use those points that you made, breathe, try and disengage your emotion from it. Also realize this person isn't mad at you. I always say that when I'm the angry customer. I tell the person on the phone, if I'm talking to someone on the phone, I'm like, look, I know this isn't your problem, but I'm mad and you're the person I've got. So you're just going to have to listen to me be mad. Mm-hmm. But remember that when you're on the other side, and then you can start, interacting with them once they've hit that crest. And really, the reality of it is that most of the time they realize whatever it is something that's probably not going to change, and it's probably not in your control to change. They just want to be heard. Is a huge part of it. But then, yes, looking to map that way forward is exactly the right way to do it, and turning it to okay, how do we solve this, right? Yep. And whether you have some suggestions, it's kind of the same as the best approach, right? From one of our previous episodes.
Correct.
Is to listen, get their ideas, propose your ideas, and then kind of synthesize the way forward from there.
Yep.
So, excellent. That wraps up our episode for today. If you have any topics to cover or questions for us, hit us up on our Twitter account at value_ability, or you can find us on the value-ability.com website. Click on the Contact Us tab, and there's a form there for you to submit questions. You can also find us on Facebook, search at Valuability, all one word, and you could post there. We will see that. Couple of questions for you guys out there. Tell us a time when you kept your cool when dealing with an angry client and how you accomplished that. And then what predictions do you think will come come true from the current COVID-19 crisis once it has passed? So write into us. Let us know your thoughts there. Submit any questions or topics as well that you would like us to cover in a future episode. Sign up for our mailing list if you'd like exclusive content. Value-ability.com. Also under the Contact Us tab is the mailing list. Like, review, subscribe, and share. Please, wherever you find us, give us that a little bit of an attaboy. It actually does help out quite a bit. Next episode, we're going to be talking about another retirement risk, inflation, the silent embezzler. So that will be very interesting to continue on that discussion. Thank you, as always, for listening. Do not forget to join us next week. And remember that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. This is a podcast collaboration, not a peer-reviewed journal or a sponsored publication. We make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, correctness, suitability, or validity of any information in this podcast, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or delays in this information, or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its display or use. All information is provided on an as-is basis. It is the listener's responsibility to verify their own facts. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on this podcast. Strategies or investments discussed may fluctuate in price or value. Investors may get back less than invested. Investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you. This material does not take into account your particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for you. You must make an independent decision regarding investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast. Before acting on information on this podcast, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and strongly consider seeking advice from your own financial or investment advisor. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Assumptions are not reflective of the position of any entity other than the authors, and since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision, and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity.